I'm Fritz Coleman.
And I'm Louise Palanker, and this is Media Path.
This is a show that we get a chance to become captivated by a certain topic, and then we take you along on a scenic back route through books and movies and music and articles, whatever are related to whatever our current obsession is.
Today, we are thrilled and honored to welcome acclaimed author-journalist Michael Isikoff. Michael Isikoff is an American investigative journalist who has worked for The Washington Post, Newsweek, and NBC News. He is the author of 2 New York Times bestsellers, maybe 3, he can clarify, Uncovering Clinton, A Reporter's Story, and Hubris, the inside story of spin, scandal, and the selling of the Iraq War, co-written with David Corn. He is a frequent guest on MSNBC, CNN, and other TV talk shows. Isikoff is currently the chief investigative correspondent for Yahoo News, and your book with David Corn, Russian Roulette, is now available in paperback, along with already Kindle, hardcover, audio, and CD. Can you talk about that a little bit, Michael, for us?
Sure, and it actually was Russian Roulette was actually a #1 New York Times bestseller, so it definitely qualifies as the third of the group. But and is just now out in paperback, new and expanded, with a new epilogue on the Trump impeachment saga. And some sort of fresh insights into what happened there. And, it is a book that, in some respects is newly relevant right now, with all the disclosures about the Russian intelligence services paying bounties to kill American soldiers in Afghanistan, and the somewhat muted response to that from the Trump administration.
Michael, let's talk about that. I mean, every day in the Trump administration, I've said today's the day when we hit the tipping point. But it just seems like this particular episode, his denial of having been briefed on this, seems to be a change point. What I mean is now people that have children fighting in Afghanistan, people that serve the country, his whole military base is being threatened by his denial of having been briefed by this. I mean, nobody is surprised that the Russians came up with this way to go after American troops, but I think what's dark about this is his lack of reaction to it and denial that he was briefed. Do you think this is going to be a change?
I mean, it's hard to say, because there have been so many moments where Donald Trump has done things or said things or tweeted things that, people thought, aha, this is going to be the turning point. This is when the scales drop from the eyes of the Republicans on Capitol Hill who have defended him. This is when his followers will finally see through him. So I don't know. I mean, certainly over the last several weeks, his poll numbers have cratered. I think it's a combination of the COVID crisis and now the spike in coronavirus cases in the southern states, the Black Lives Matter protests, and the way he's responded to them. There's been a sort of steady number of these sort of political fiascos for the president. This comes on top of that. We will see whether he can get by it. But I think in many ways the Russia story is the central one, because it's been such a defining story for the entire Trump presidency.
It appears to be his one consistent viewpoint. The one thing that he stays very focused on is his devotion to Vladimir Putin. And we saw with Black Lives Matter, we saw tragic event after tragic event, and then we hit the tipping point of Mr. Floyd. Do you feel like perhaps when it comes to our troops, which we hold so sacred, this is that tipping point? for
it could be. I mean, there are certain caveats here. We do need to know more about the intelligence and exactly what it was, how it came in, what the confidence level of the various intelligence agencies were in it. There's pretty intriguing new reports about financial transfers from the Russians to the Taliban that are that leap out. We just reported on Yahoo News. I and a colleague, Sean Naylor, wrote about how actually the U.S. military had intelligence for some years now about Russian contacts with the Taliban, the Russians providing weapons to the Taliban and financial assistance. That goes back to at least 2016, the latter days of the Obama administration. And then by 2018, the U.S. military had credible reports that the Russians were encouraging Taliban fighters to kill Americans. So in some ways, this is part of a pattern of behavior that has led to the reports about the bounties. And the one consistent theme of Donald Trump's presidency is he doesn't want to hear or doesn't want to be briefed on reports of Russian misbehavior, because anytime the subject comes up, it just reminds him of what he views as the Russia hoax, what he views as his political persecution by his enemies using the Russian intervention in the 2016 election as a way to raise questions about his victory over Hillary Clinton in 2016. That's something he cannot abide by. So instead of looking at this through the lens of what's best for America, what's best for what's best for U.S.-Russian relations, and how we must stop Russian aggression and Russian misbehavior, he looks at it entirely through the prism of himself. And is this going to somehow cast a cloud over him?
But you know that he knows it's not a hoax. You know that he knows that he's involved with Putin. So what are your theories, like, that you can't say on MSNBC because it would be conjecture, but what are your theories when you talk to David about the why of all of this? What do you guys?
Look, we spelled it out in the book, I think, pretty clearly. And, there's no question that Donald Trump had wanted to do business in Russia for years. There's no question that he basically tried to establish a relationship with Vladimir Putin, and he praised upon Vladimir Putin and talked about what a great guy he was, and tried to get together with him when he went to Moscow, when Trump went to Moscow in 2013 for the Miss Universe pageant. His main goal there was to meet Putin, to forge a relationship with Putin. Why? Because his main interest there was developing a Trump Tower in Moscow, and he figured if he could get Putin's blessing for that, the deal would go through. On top of that, it's pretty clear that Trump saw an affinity in Putin. Putin runs Russia the way Trump would like to run America, basically with no backtalk from anybody or else.
Yeah.
That's very appealing to Trump. And it's also worth and again, we do this in Russian Roulette. We just sort of construct or reconstruct how this relationship between Trump and Putin evolved over the years. So Trump goes to Moscow in 2013 for Miss Universe. He actually signs a deal for that Trump Tower project while he was there, a letter of intent to build it with a oligarch, Aris Galarov, who was very close with Putin, who had just been awarded a medal by Putin. He was a huge real estate construction magnate in Russia. And the deal was going to be financed by a Russian state-owned bank. And all that, in fact, this that was in November 2013. In February of 2014, Ivanka Trump flies to Moscow and gets together with Emin Agalarov, the pop singer son of the oligarch Aras Agalarov, and they go scouting for potential sites for the Trump Tower Moscow project. That's February 2013. What happens right after that, in March of 2014? Putin intervenes in Ukraine. He seizes Crimea. He moves in the little green men into Ukraine, and the US and the European Union responds by imposing sanctions on the Russians. This was the first time since World War II in which, you know, a country had invaded another country, you know, and taken over its property, and this was taken over its territory. And so there's pushback. There's the imposition of sanctions. One of the entities that was sanctioned was the very same Russian state-owned bank that was going to finance the Trump Tower deal in Moscow. After those sanctions, the deal sinks. The deal craters. It can't go through anymore. So Trump, from his perspective, the sanctions on Russia imposed because of its aggression in Ukraine tanked his business deal. It cost him money. And I think it tells you everything you need to know about Trump's attitude towards sanctions and sanctions imposed by Obama. You know, it colored Trump's entire perspective. And you see, by the time in 2015, when he starts running for president, he very early on makes clear in an appearance in Las Vegas at Freedom Fest, when he's asked out of the blue a question from the audience by a woman named Maria Butina, a Russian woman who just happened to be there. Trump says, you know, if I get elected president, you won't need these sanctions. So
why not get
he's
along
on the record that he will lift sanctions on Russia.
So, Michael, I'm sure nobody's more fascinated than you and David by the way the public has reacted to all of the evidence, the overwhelming evidence about a Russian connection. Your book, Craig Unger's book, and then the icing on the cake was the Muller investigation. It sort of put a human face on all of these facts. Why do you think that this hasn't gotten traction with the American public? Where's the rage in the American public?
Well,
is it that,
look, that's a very good question.
Anti-media rant is actually paying off and making people soften their feeling about it?
Look, the Mueller report was had a lot of important material in it. I mean, it established, beyond any beyond doubt, that the Russians mounted this unprecedented campaign to disrupt our election, to influence our election. It was the hacks of emails. It was the dumping of emails. It was the social media manipulation by the Internet Research Agency. It was the probing of state election systems, and that the Russian intervention was welcomed by the Trump campaign. Russia, if you're listening, I hope you can find, those missing emails of Hillary Clinton. Trump was, unabashed about reaching out to the Russians. And although he would later say it was a joke, the Russians didn't view it that way. Within hours after Trump made those statements, they were probing Hillary Clinton's own personal computer servers, trying to find the emails that Donald Trump was looking for. So they were talking to each other through the worldwide media and in public forums. But I think that for a lot of people, the Mueller report was a disappointment because people's expectations were set too high. You had this thing called the Steele dossier, which we write a lot about in the book, which actually ended up making a lot of allegations that did not bear out, that could not be substantiated, and in fact, in some cases, were proven to be false. And yet, I got to say, the media has some responsibility here, because they played these up as though it was all true. And when Mueller could not substantiate some of the allegations you heard repeatedly on MSNBC and CNN, I think there was a letdown, and
there was a lot of
Trump
salacious stuff in there that attracted
vindicated
people's attention. And when that turned out to be false, and kind of buried the whole thing.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, it was more than just the so-called P-tape that did not bear out. There were other claims about a well-developed conspiracy that simply wasn't what we were looking at. What we were looking at was something else. Very serious, absolutely deserved attention, but it was not, it did not fit the conspiracy theories of the Trump critics.
I just want to ask you one more thing. You were talking about the emails, and that is, what do you think the future for Julian Assange is? Why has he gone dark all of a sudden? And
well, isn't he in jail right now, awaiting extradition?
So is that what it is?
I mean, I mean, he's he's been indicted in the United States.
Okay,
and,
so it's the process.
He's going through an extradition hearing, and look, he was willingly used as either as an accomplice or a stooge of the Russians. He was used to dump these emails, and didn't show much curiosity. If he knew where they were. If he knew where they were coming from and didn't disclose it, then he was concealing important information from the public. If he didn't know, he showed a remarkable lack of curiosity about where he got his material.
Can you clarify for all of us the Roger Stone connection? What is his role? Does he help the Russians understand what to dump when?
No, and that's again another one of the claims that were not borne out by Robert Mueller's investigation. Roger Stone is an opportunist. Roger Stone is a self-styled dirty trickster. Roger Stone was doing everything he could to try to establish a relationship with Julian Assange and learn what was in the stolen emails that Assange was given access to. And then trying to use the suggestion that he did know to curry favor with Donald Trump himself. But in fact, I mean, Roger Stone was prosecuted for brazenly lying to the House Intelligence Committee about his efforts to communicate with WikiLeaks. But if you look closely at the evidence in the trial, it's pretty clear that he never did. Or if he did, the FBI and all the U.S. intelligence agencies couldn't find the evidence for it, because he was never. It was never shown that he did have a relationship with WikiLeaks. So in many respects, the whole Roger Stone case was a case of bullshitters bullshitting other bullshitters, and and had Roger Stone not so egregiously lied about what he was trying to do to the House Intelligence Committee, he probably never wouldn't have gotten into the jam that he's in.
But all that seems to be lost when you see the Department of Justice trying to soften the sentences and all that. Then it makes it seem a little more nefarious, and you kind of forget what the original charge was, and it just seems all very, very underhanded.
Yeah, and look, the conduct of the Barr Justice Department here has only fueled the questions about all these cases, and I'm a little surprised, because I've known William Barr for years. I covered him when he was Attorney General the first time around. I always thought he was a pretty smart guy, and politically savvy guy. There was never any question that he was a political partisan, but he knew the law. He had a pretty good sense of the way the Justice Department worked. And, by most accounts, he was a reasonably successful attorney general the first time around. And this time around, whether it's because he's working for Donald Trump or or he spent too much time in semi-retirement watching Fox News, he has not shown any political deafness at all in his handling of cases. And while I think he's convinced himself that there were oversteps by the Mueller team and oversteps by the FBI, he hasn't been, he's ended up undermining the Justice Department and the most important thing it has, which is a public acceptance that they are going to handle criminal cases without fear or favor, without political influence. That's been ingrained in our political culture since Watergate. And William Barr, for whatever reason, does not seem to have understood that the way he's handled these matters relating to those Mueller prosecutions has undermined the most important thing that the Justice Department has.
He supposedly espouses the unitary executive theory, where there's nothing more powerful than the president, so he doesn't have to be held responsible for anything. I don't know how anybody that understands the Constitution of the United States thinks that's the way America's supposed to act. It doesn't seem right to me.
I mean, look, the unitary executive theory, like all theories about the law, can be interpreted in different ways. There's certainly plenty of respectable conservatives who have propounded the unitary executive theory, and we had a number of Supreme Court justices, most prominently Antonin Scalia, who accepted it. But you can stretch it way beyond where most people would want it to go into scary lengths. Barr is a puzzle to me, like I said, because I've known the guy for a long time, and I'm just really surprised he's gotten into as many messes as he has.
Do you feel, or do you have any kind of theories that Republican representatives and perhaps Barr and perhaps Michael Flynn, for example, are also beholden to Putin or Turkey? Or do you speculate about, what's the underbelly like? What are we going to learn within the next 5 years about what was motivating all these individuals?
Well, I think we've learned a lot, and I think we know a lot, and a lot of it is a matter of public record. Look, Michael Flynn, went to Moscow in December 2015, was paid to attend the 10th anniversary of RT, the Russian propaganda station, ended up sitting next to Vladimir Putin at the gala dinner, celebrating this, propaganda station that regularly seeks to portray the United States in the worst possible light of all. That was a sort of egregious step for a former U.S. director of the Defense Intelligence Agency. And, he becomes Trump's national security advisor, and, like Trump, sloughed off all questions about Russia, viewed it as the whole Russia story as coming from Democratic partisans. And, then has these conversations with Ambassador Kislyak, the Russian ambassador, during the transition, which he proceeds to lie about to the FBI. Now, I think that Flynn was, Flynn acted in ways that are inexplicable, except once you learn that once you sort of try to connect the dots to figure out why he would lie about his conversations with Kislyak. And you go back when it first gets reported, that he was talking to the Russian ambassador during the transition about sanctions on Russia on January 12th, 2017, by David Ignatius in the Washington Post. Trump, upon seeing this report, pounds the table and says, kill the story, kill the story. He doesn't want any attention to the fact that one of his people was talking to the Russian ambassador. Remember, the Trump campaign has already said there were no contacts with the Russians at all. And here seemed to be fresh evidence that there were indeed contacts, at least during the transition period. So Flynn, being the good soldier, bows to the president's wishes and proceeds to deny he had conversations that he very clearly did. So I think it was Flynn's efforts to please the big guy, Donald Trump, that got him into the mess that he did. And this may be the one known case where Donald Trump may actually have had some remorse. He knew that Flynn was doing his bidding when he lied about these conversations. And that's why very shortly, what's the first thing he does as president that gets him into real trouble? He says to Comey, I hope you can see fit to let Michael.
Isn't he just really afraid that people are going to flip? Everyone has stories. He's dealing with people who have their own version of those dealings. So isn't he just terrified that when someone flips, it's going to be...
yeah, I mean, listen, that's certainly worth speculating about, but at this point, I think we got to stick to the facts. Michael Flynn had, more than a year of cooperation with Robert Mueller's team, was interviewed for hours and hours and hours, and Mueller's people were satisfied that he told them everything he had to tell them. And they went to court and said, he's been a good cooperating witness, and he doesn't need to go to jail. If Michael Flynn had accepted his guilty plea, which he pled to twice, he would have been a convicted felon, but he never would have been threatened with any jail time. So I think the idea that Flynn had some deep, dark secrets to tell, you have to stack that up against the fact that Mueller's team had more than a year crack at him, grilled him about everything, checked everything he had to say, and reported what they reported, and it didn't go much beyond what we write about in Russian Roulette.
Michael, we want to talk about the great expansion of your book. I just want to ask you a couple more questions. How dominant do you think the Russian trolls are going to be in the 2020 election? Have we become sufficiently aware to sort of ward off the effect of that, or are we exactly where we were in 2016?
Well, look, I think we are a lot more attuned to what the Russians could do, and particularly on the social media front, because one of the striking things when David Korn and I were writing Russian Roulette that we discovered is that while the Internet Research Agency, that Russian troll farm in St. Petersburg that was so active creating phony Twitter bots and phony Facebook accounts, all masquerading as American political actors when they were really just Russian trolls in St. Petersburg, all that, the US intelligence community was completely blind to it. Nobody was watching it. Nobody was detecting what the Russians were up to in real time. They knew about the hacks. They knew about the dumping of emails. They knew about the probing of state election systems. But, when you reconstruct all the White House conversations under President Obama about this, the social media component never came up. It was a massive intelligence failure by U.S. intelligence agencies.
And one other question about that, and then we'll talk about the book, I promise.
And now clearly we do. So I think that, and the social media companies know about it as well.
That's what I wanted to ask you about, the culpability of the social media companies. Now Facebook's under fire. Do you think this is a thing where we should allow them to self-police, or is it time for us to get Congress to enact some structure into this?
That's a huge question, and you're getting Congress involved, and God knows what you could come up with, what they would come up with, and whether it would be better. But I listen. This is one of the biggest issues that we have to grapple with as a country because it's so central to our democratic dialogue. Are these social media companies that have become the main source of news for a huge chunk of Americans? Are they responsible actors, and are they willy-nilly letting a lot of very malicious actors get access to their platform to present fake news and propaganda as real media? I think the Twitter and Facebook and Instagram, they're learning. They know that this is a hot issue, and you're seeing much more self-policing. But whether it's enough is, we're just going to have to wait and see. It is worth noting that Facebook during 2016 was selling all these hundreds of ads to the internet research agency trolls, which were paying for them in rubles, and yet never raised any questions about whether they really were who they said they were.
Do you think that content consumers are more informed this election cycle, to where, at least if you're not a member of the QAnon cult, that you might see something and say, I don't know about that? Because I also think that Russians they're creating websites and they're creating viral content to own the libs, like the guy that was licking all of the disinfectants in a store, stuff that they know will enrage us. That's actually, a lot of it, I've heard, is created by Russians just to drive liberals crazy and distract us.
Well, first of all, we should point out it's not just the Russians. I think that, there are other nation state adversaries, the Chinese, the Iranians, the North Koreans, that are playing in this space as well. And there are non-state actors that have an interest in manipulating social media in the United States. So this is not just a Russian thing. But I think the thing that I would be most concerned about at this point is the development of a deep fake technology using AI, artificial intelligence, where you can make really compelling, seemingly legitimate videos of people saying things they never said. And, in those last days of the election, maybe the last hours of the election, I think it's entirely plausible that we will see these sort of things popping up left and right. And, at a time when it'll be impossible for people to push back and get the real truth. A video of Joe Biden saying all sorts of nonsensical things, right? It just pops up on the internet a day before the election, and then, it gets widely circulated, goes viral. That's, I think, the danger, because it will look so real. It will look so legitimate. And I think that's
Michael, tell us, I got to tell folks, the four people in America that haven't read your book, as Nancy Pelosi says a couple times a month, all roads lead to Putin. And if you want a spectacular primer on the tributaries that lead to the Russian connection, you need to read Russian Roulette. And I'm anxious to hear about the changes, the additions.
There it is.
It looks pretty good in softcover too, doesn't it?
Yes, it does. Yeah, it's got the words #1 New York Times bestseller on it. So we like
it's
that.
Really wonderful. Right. So you said you added some things?
Yeah, we added some new material. Actually, we wrote this before the Muller report came out. And we wanted to add material from the Muller report. Although I got to say, almost everything we wrote held up pretty darn well. So we didn't have to change a lot, but we did add a bit from the Mueller report. And the other thing we did was, did an epilogue on the impeachment battle, which, was seen as the Ukraine scandal, but as we make clear, it was really just the flip side of the Russia story. The Ukraine is, Trump's machinations about grew out of his determination to undercut the Mueller investigation. One of the things we did in the epilogue that's kind of interesting is we just reconstructed Donald Trump's morning on July 25th, 2019. That's the morning of his fateful phone call with Zelensky, the president of Ukraine, where he says, "I hope you can do us a favor, though." And so what was Trump doing that morning? He was in the White House residence, holed up in the residence, glued to the TV, watching Fox and Friends, reveling in Fox and Friends coverage of Robert Mueller's testimony the day before the House Judiciary Committee. And if you remember, this was a somewhat underwhelming performance by Mueller. He was reluctant witness. He didn't really want to be there. He got confused at times about aspects of what was in the report, although he did make clear that its bottom line conclusions about a sweeping and systematic campaign by the Russians to interfere in the election was real, and that there were truly troublesome acts of obstruction by the president himself to try to impede his inquiry. But and Trump is watching this, he's reveling in it, he's tweeting about it. Impeachment, it's over, he tweets that morning. The Mueller investigation has been discredited. He is reveling in it. It is Trump's time for what his former Homeland Security advisor described as getting his pound of flesh. He now wants revenge for all of those people who put Mueller up to his appointment, who talked about the Mueller inquiry, who enabled the investigation of him. And there's something else that's interesting that morning. Released that very morning, a new Quinnipiac poll that shows Trump losing by 8 points to Joe Biden in the state of Ohio, perhaps the most crucial, most battleground state. No Republican has ever been elected without carrying Ohio. Biden was the only Democratic candidate who beat him there. So you take those two data points, reveling in Mueller's underwhelming performance, determination to get his pound of flesh, and the concern about Joe Biden. And it tells you everything you need to know about what happened that morning. Fox and Friends goes off the air at 9 a.m. At 9:03, 3 minutes later, the White House switchboard patches through the phone call to Zelensky. And
so I have a question for you, Michael, regarding that phone call specifically, and then Fox. When Trump says to Zelensky, "So I understand you guys have the DNC server," does he really think that, or is he just the perfect Fox viewer who's buying into whatever?
That is the single wackiest conspiracy theory that you can dream up. And Trump is conspiracy theorist in chief, and that's how he it started with the birthers and has continued throughout. But the idea that the DNC server somehow migrated thousands of miles away to some basement in Kiev is just absurd. There's not a single piece of evidence that would support this. But Trump's obsession is he cannot accept the fact that the Russians did what they did. And so therefore he's got to come up with alternative explanations. We did a 6-part podcast series last year for Yahoo called Conspiracy Land, in which we focused on one in particular. That was the conspiracy theories about Seth Rich. Seth Rich was the young Democratic National Committee staffer who was tragically killed in a botched robbery on the streets of Washington in July of 2016. But to Trump allies and the Russians, Seth Rich became, exhibit A for this conspiracy theory that it was actually he who leaked the DNC emails to WikiLeaks. It wasn't the Russians. Therefore, the entire Russia story was a hoax and had nothing to it. And by the way, because he leaked those emails, Hillary Clinton's operatives conspired to assassinate him
So is your thesis that Russia is cooking up these theories that they know will take hold in right-wing America?
And we actually showed that very clearly in Conspiracy Land, that in some respects, these theories were planted by Russian intelligence operatives and then amplified by Russian bots, the same internet research agency that was posting all these phony Twitter bots masquerading as Americans and Facebook ads. They were also promoting the Seth Rich conspiracy theories because it undermined the Mueller investigation. To those who believed it, it would get Russia off the hook. And of course, by the way, eventually these conspiracy theories migrate to Fox News, and it's shouted from the rooftops by Sean Hannity and his cohorts.
I think the most disturbing thing about this pattern is not that they're created, because evil expands to the space it's given. But what drives me the craziest is the number of people that buy these hideously ridiculous theories. Anybody, you don't even have to read a newspaper. It just violates what makes sense. That's what scares me the most.
But it's somehow in alignment with their values, and so they just eat it up. Yeah. Well, our show is called Media Path because we want to explore everywhere one could possibly travel if they're obsessed by a topic. So I'm going to go through a reading list of what I consumed after Trump was elected, and it's a little feverish, so forgive me. Russian Roulette by Michael Isikoff and David Korn, Hillbilly Elegy by J.D. Vance, Unbelievable by Katie Tur, Facts and Fears by James Clapper, Fire and Fury by Michael Wolff, Fear by Bob Woodward, Red Notice by Bill Browder, House of Trump, House of Putin by Craig Unger, What Happened by Hillary Clinton, The Plot to Hack America and the Plot to Destroy Democracy by Malcolm Nance, A Higher Loyalty by James Comey, The Threat by Andrew McCabe, Crime in Progress by Glenn Simpson and Peter Frisch. And Fritz, have you got your reading list?
Well, I read a lot. Well, I didn't read all those. I can't lie to you, but I read a lot of them. And I added 2 to the list, American Carnage by Tim Alberta, which is a little dense. I don't know if you read it, Michael, but it's a great sort of an autopsy of the Republican Party leading up to Trump, and I found it fascinating.
It's a very good book, and we had Tim Alberta on our Skullduggery podcast.
And one other one that I read, and I want to before you decide to leave us, ask you about. It's Dark Towers, David Enrich. That was a Wall Street Journal investigative reporter that goes into the Deutsche Bank collapse and the Deutsche Bank connection to all this. And my question to you is, do you think that if and when the Supreme Court or wherever this thing sits now in the appeals court decides to allow or force them to release their records to Congress, that will be the treasure trove that sort of buttons up all that you suggested in Russian Roulette and these other books have suggested?
There's a lot of ifs there, and assuming that the Supreme Court will, in fact, order those Deutsche Bank records to be turned over. I don't know. But from what I know, look, we do know that Deutsche Bank was the one bank that was willing to lend to Donald Trump when nobody else would, when every other bank knew that he was a deadbeat. Every other bank knew about his track record for bankruptcies in Atlantic City. Everybody else was wary of him. But Deutsche Bank, for reasons that David writes about in the book, the pressure to come up with new, brand name, high name clients, the fact that he was a celebrity, the personalities involved, established relations with Trump, and they agreed, much to their later regret, to lend all this money to Donald Trump and the Trump Organization. At the same time, we do know that that Deutsche Bank was implicated in laundering money for various Russian oligarchs and other Russian entities. But I have yet to see any evidence that connects those two threads, the loans. And I questioned David Enright, who wrote the book about this, and he too agrees he has no evidence that can connect the Russian money laundering to the loans to Donald Trump, two separate entities, two separate parts of the bank. I'm not even sure it makes sense that the Russian money laundering activities would have anything to do with the funds that go to Donald Trump. So look, anything's possible. I'm open to, and I think anytime you put the microscope on Donald Trump's finances, I mean, clearly we know there's plenty he's tried to hide. There's plenty that has not been available for public inspection. He's the only president that hasn't released his tax returns. He still hasn't. So anything is possible, but I would not want to pin my hopes on that particular claim bearing out.
Well, there may not be a direct connection, but they certainly saw him as amoral, and that's your perfect useful idiot is somebody that has no more.
Yeah, and there's no question that Russians and Saudis and Emiratis and others saw Trump properties as investments they would want to make, and bought them through LLCs, and that's a very good way of laundering money. It's not unique to the Trump Organization. It's a phenomenon that we've seen across the board. In American real estate has been used as ways for a lot of shady characters around the world, not just American real estate, British real estate in London Stan. This is a worldwide phenomenon.
Well,
You've been really generous with your time, Michael. I just wanted to ask you a writerly question. How do you write a book with another person? How did you and David split the responsibility?
Ask David about that. This is our second book together, and we're both pretty ornery, stubborn characters. So there's a lot of back and forth. But in two cases, the Iraq War book, Hubris, and Russian Roulette, we got it done, and it turned out very well. And I think we're both pretty proud of the product.
Do you take an area that one has an expertise in and the other doesn't?
I mean, there was a lot of dividing up. We both had intensively reported on the Trump-Russia connection during the 2016 campaign. We both had our own wealth of sources that we were able to tap into for this. And, I think we were I think we did the most comprehensive account of Trump's Russia dealings that anybody's done.
I agree. Well, can you tell us what you are currently investigating?
No, I can't tell you that. But a lot of juicy material. And these days, there's no shortage of things to investigate.
All right, excellent. Well, I'm going to thank you so much for being with us and then read the closing credits. We are Media Path with Fritz Coleman and Louise Palanker. Our producer is Dina Friedman. Our engineer is Francesco Demanda. Our sound mixer is John Maddox. Our webmaster is Bill Filipiak. Our theme music is Journals by Louise Palanker. We are so thankful to our guest, Michael Isikoff. Thank you for being with us.
A real honor, Michael. Thank you for spending so much time.
Thank you. Great to be with you.